Greetings, fellow makers! I'm Bill. Welcome to the shop. Today, you're going to learn how to transmute foam into steel. To hang all of our armor pieces, I glued on a bunch of scrap foam to the back of the armor. Do you recognize those scraps? Yes, of course, those are the puzzle piece edges that peel away from the sides of your floor mats. I sanded away some of the texture on the spots in the back of the armor where I wanted to connect these straps. They were barged into place, nice and securely. This way I could use my homemade hanging clamps to hold the parts while painting. I also taped off all the Velcro on any of the areas, especially the chest armor. This was to keep them from getting all gummed up from our Plasti Dip and paint. I decided to seal all of our armor with Plasti Dip. Now, a while back we did a video on a whole bunch of different ways to seal your foam, so I recommend giving that a look to pick a method that works well for you in your situation. For this project, I went with Plasti Dip because it's extremely convenient in a spray can and it dries pretty fast. It also leaves a little bit of a texture that I actually wanted to incorporate into my final paint job. I sprayed on 3 good layers of Plasti Dip and let it dry. Now, if you're doing this at home, be sure to work in a well-ventilated area whenever you're spraying rubber out of a can. The base coat of color on the armor was a rattle can of bronze spray paint. This is some nice paint that I really like. It has a dark, metallic, warm color to it. I avoided just going straight to a silver or steel spray paint because I wanted to build a couple of layers of metallic color in varieties of shades and colors. This layer added a nice platform for us to build the rest of our steel paint job. The first addition on top of that was a dark metallic color. These are some nice acrylic paints, and I mixed together a bright silver with a little bit of black to give me something that was like a little bit of a darker iron color. Then, using a ratty old chip brush, I started adding lots of light strokes of paint all over the armor. I wasn't trying to cover everything here. I was just trying to add a little bit of metallic contrast to the base color without being too heavy-handed. You can see when we compare a piece that was painted to an unpainted piece, there's just a nice little hint of a dark metallic sheen. This scratchy metallic layer of paint was added to all of the armor pieces and left to dry. Once that was dry, I did a similar thing with the unmixed silver acrylic paint. The real goal with this layer was to create some brighter contrast and texture compared to the darker layer below. I used that same old chip brush and I kept it mostly dry and added only a little bit of paint at a time. It is, of course, way easier to add layers on top than to try and take them off if you overdo it. All of the armor pieces got this treatment. Compared to a before and after, you can see how much of a difference this brighter silver layer makes. That finished the base coat of metal, but there was some leather parts that we had to tackle. The first layer of leather paint was done with more of that nice acrylic paint, this time in a dark brown color. This layer was carefully brushed on by hand, totally covering the layer of paint we sprayed on below it. Using nicer paints like this is great because it covers really well and I only had to brush on one layer. When it was dry and similar to the metal, another layer was added on top of that base brown color. This was a darker brown that was added sparingly to create a little bit of texture and contrast. It was also applied with that beat up old chip brush. Sometimes these layers can be kind of subtle, but once you add many of them, you'll nail the look that you're going for. To make a lighter texture on the leather parts, I mixed up some yellow, brown, and red to get kind of an orangish color. I also thinned it down a whole bunch with water so that I could apply the color in some light layers. I really didn't want to overdo it. These highlights were added again with that hero chip brush, a little bit at a time, and I let it dry. Once it did dry, you can see that the colors faded a little bit. And that's cool, because we're going for subtlety here. This completed all of the base colors on our armor, so it was time to seal it all in. You see, the remaining weathering layers would be done with more of those acrylics, and if I let those new paints mingle with the paints that were already laid down, they would actually lift the lower layers of paint, and we don't want that. So everything was sealed with a spray varnish. You could also use your favorite clear spray paint, but I like varnish because it's flexible and it dries really fast. Once the varnish dried, it was time to weather the armor. This is where it really comes to life. I started by hitting all of the armor pieces with a rust layer. This was done with acrylic paints in a burnt sienna and a dark brown. You can get really creative with your rust colors. Go out in the world and see what rusty things look like. Take pictures of them. But for this one, I went fairly basic. Using a small brush, I brushed on the rusty colors into all the grooves and crevices where it would accumulate on a real piece of armor. I didn't add too much paint. Instead, I chose to brush it on a tiny bit at a time. This let me really control where the paint went and how much went down. Again, I didn't want to overdo it here. If I did go a little bit heavy, then I could wipe away the extra paint with a wet paper towel. In some areas, like the screw heads, I tried to add some subtle lines where rust might have dripped down a bit. For the flatter areas, I picked up that Hero chip brush again, and with just a hint of paint, I added some scratches to the surface of the armor. Then, with a wet paper towel, I tamped and wiped most of that away, leaving just some nice rusty colored scratches. Every single armor piece got the rust treatment, and you can see this step really starts to bring the armor into the real world. The next layer of weathering was a darker shading. This was done with more acrylic paints, this time a black, and I mixed it right on the same palette as my weathering paints. It's okay for them to mingle a little bit. I took the tiniest bit of black paint, just a little bit, on the tip of the brush and darkened in the deeper areas on the detail of my armor. Now, I didn't cover every single spot. I wanted there to be a little bit of irregularity to the finish. But the real goal here was to add some nice dark contrast to the areas that would normally not see much sunlight. Since the rust layer wasn't sealed, this black paint mixed a little bit with the rusty paint, and that's totally fine. I let the paints mix purposely as I brushed it on to blend them together, creating a more weather-worn finish. And I really didn't want to see individual brush strokes, so I would go over a spot quite a few times with the brush to sort of blend everything together. This is another fairly subtle layer, but you can see the difference when compared to a piece that only has the rust. This same shading layer was added to all of the leather parts. The real goal here was just to add some nice contrast and shading to the areas where the leather meets the metal. The final layer of paint, and if we're counting the plasti dip, that makes 7 of them, was to bring back some of those lovely silver highlights. As we added more and more paint to these base metallic colors, everything ended up getting just a little bit dulled. So, with that same favorite chip brush, I got to bring back some more shine. This was accomplished with more of that bright silver acrylic paint, added in dry brush passes, using just a whiff of paint, just a little bit. I quickly scratched up the surfaces with that silver. This adds just a little bit of pigment, mostly to the edges of the details, creating even more contrast. Sometimes this can be really subtle and difficult to see the progress until you compare it to a piece that hasn't been dry brushed yet. You can clearly see how much more this adds to a real metallic look. A similar effect was accomplished on the leather bits, but with more of that tan orange color. This was not thinned with water this time, but it was applied with light passes to highlight the edges of the leather and add some contrast to help it look a little bit more worn out. And that was the very last bit of painting on our armor. I could go in and seal this with more of that varnish, but I didn't want to dull that shiny metallic silver that we put on the end. If it ends up getting worn off, I can always paint a little bit more on later. I gotta tell you, I'm super happy with how this turned out. And yes, I know it's a lot of tedious layers of paint, but I think we can all agree the results speak for themselves, so it was totally worth it. Plus, all it took was a handful of good acrylic paints and some cheap brushes, so there's no reason not to give this technique a try on your own Skyrim armor.